You're listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. I'm Susan Wood. For this episode, we're going to be discussing supports for older Australians with a disability, from the NDIS to my aged care funding. I feel like, for the most part, we know what the NDIS is, but for those who may be unfamiliar, here's a bit of a background. The National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS, was introduced into Parliament by the Gillard government in 2012. The NDIS was initially called Disability Australia, and the scheme was intended to help fund supports such as carers, tailored new wheelchairs, home modifications, and physiotherapy for people under the age of 65. It was a massive undertaking at the time. In 2013, the Australian federal budget initially committed $14.3 billion to the NDIS, with the express intention to continually fund it through the Medicare levy. So you can understand the excitement. This national scheme would bring about a fundamental change for so many people with disabilities. But ultimately, there are people who are left out. The NDIS entitles people who are under the age of 65 to support funding related to their disability. You'll hear from lived experiences such as Susan.
I had a traumatic brain injury in 2005, which left me with left side hemiplegia.
But was able to get onto the NDIS before she turned 65. And you'll hear about the changes that the NDIS has made for her and her life. You'll also hear from Di, who is the wife and primary carer to her husband Gary.
Hi, my name's Di Brown, and I'm the primary carer for my husband who had a spinal cord injury in 2019 when we were overseas in the UK having a gap year.
They rely on the government's aged care funding for financial support. And you'll also hear from Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan Bingham. I'm a Policy and Advocacy Officer with SCIA's Sydney Advocacy team, and I focus specifically on systemic advocacy.
Our Policy and Advocacy team are people who are passionate about individual and systemic advocacy for those with disability. We're going to discuss the opportunities that the NDIS has given Susan, the sacrifices that Di and Gary have had to make in order to afford modifications and to fund much needed support services, the ins and outs of aged care funding, and what you can do to help. Okay, now maybe we'll start with you, Susan. Do you mind just talking a little bit about the supports that you've had over the years? So I understand that your disability was around about 20 years ago, is that correct?
Previous to the NDIS, got the government primary package, so I used that. And then wonderfully, the NDIS came along because it was costing me a lot of money just to pay for physio and stuff. Plus, I really didn't know where to go. You get out of hospital and you're sort of like, if you live by yourself, you're left to search stuff out for yourself. But then the NDIS came along. And because I started searching stuff out for myself, I decided, well, hey, I'm not going to wait for them to contact me. So I contacted them with all my reports. So I had everything ready, one of the first people in my area to get on board with them.
Susan is largely independent and lives at home by herself. She has support workers such as a cleaner. So as she found better, more adequate supports, she had discovered that there were services that could not only benefit her long term, but services she hadn't even heard about before the NDIS.
I'd never heard of exercise physiology previous to NDIS. I was seeing physiotherapy, and I used to join a joint session at the local private hospital, pay for that for myself.
And so what sort of improvements, if any, that you've seen in yourself since going to exercise physio?
Confidence is a big one. And also, because I wear a leg brace too, and I use a walking stick on my left side, for my left side. With getting the stretches that I do with physiology, it's helped a lot to get me motoring. Up in hospital, I lost all the power that I'd sort of built up. By that I mean strength, built up over the years, being in hospital and coming home, and I'm missing out on my sessions. I lost so much of my strength, so I'm having to start to rebuild that up again.
Overall, would you say that being on the NDIS has been beneficial for you in regards to your disability?
100% improved my life, yeah.
Yeah, could you just elaborate on how it's improved your life?
Cost-wise, so cost-wise, it's improved. Plus, you get a friendship from the carers, which, you might not and I've also got friendship from the exercise people, which, you know, like what happened, I went to hospital, come out of hospital when all this happened, come home, and I was like, maybe like 2 years before I came back to my district, and at my age, a lot of my friends had died or moved. So I lost all my, circle of people that I knew, so it was like starting again when you're disabled and not lost your confidence.
What is the difference between the NDIS financial support and aged care financial support? Megan explains.
So I think it's important to think about the foundation of the NDIS. So the NDIS is really founded under the United Nations Convention under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So because of that, the human rights framework underlying the NDIS really enforces that it's about empowering people with disability to ensure that they can live independent, dignified lives, ensuring that they have all their human rights respected, protected, and fulfilled. When we look at the aged care system, even though people with disability, the only difference is that they're over the age of 65, we see a major paradigm shift in the way the programs are treated. And so we see a lot of over 65-year-olds with disabilities making compromises constantly because simply the level of funding is capped. Under the NDIS, it is not capped. It is based on the reasonable and necessary supports that a person needs. Under the aged care system, everyone is put into brackets, income brackets, it's means tested. And so the whole philosophy is much more around meeting people's health needs rather than empowerment and rehabilitation. And so many people through the aged care system have to decide what can I go without rather than what do I need holistically to empower my life. I think it's so important for people to have all their support needs met, but also not just those immediate support needs met, the long-term goals and aspirations that they have. So they receive supports, they are aware of services, innovations, assistive technology that not only match their support needs, but also match their long-term goals. And people shouldn't be forced into nursing homes and aged care residential facilities simply because they can't afford to um, facilitate home modifications. People should have their goals and needs met. If that's remaining at home, that should be supported. So I think it's really about independence, choice and control, some of those buzzwords from the NDIS. But it really comes back to the philosophy of we care about people, we respect the dignity of people, and that requires not just a focus on immediate supports or health needs, but also matching supports and services to people's long-term goals and aspirations.
Well, my husband was injured in England, and so he was taken to a tertiary hospital in London and in intensive care there. Unfortunately, they didn't know how to treat spinal injury. So he got really sick as a consequence of their lack of knowledge and nearly died with infections and bowel obstructions and a whole range of things. Luckily, a pretty strong advocate because the insurance company is not very keen on flying people back from the UK because they say the equivalent, the health system is equivalent between here and there. But I put the onus on them that if he died, it would be their responsibility if they didn't send him back. And finally, he came back in an air ambulance and came to one of the specialty spinal units in New South Wales. And the care was just extraordinarily different. People complain about the health system here, but really, the care and the knowledge was just extraordinarily good. And he immediately, even in ICU, started to get rehab for his spinal injury. And that was 6 weeks after the event. Whereas in the UK, he'd had no physio or anything. So he was in the spinal unit for 7 months for acute care and then rehab. I'm a registered nurse by background, so I'm sort of familiar with the system, so able to advocate probably more than a lot of other people can. And tried to talk to other partners or wives of people who'd had spinal injury to see, because I just didn't understand. It's such a big change in your life, not only for the person, but for your whole family, and how people dealt with it. And kind of, I don't know, I just felt I needed something to understand it more. But what I found was talking to other women who've had their partners or husbands badly injured, people are so immersed in the tragedy of it all, they actually haven't got the mental capacity to provide support to anybody else. So it's a journey that you make on your own.
Funding for over 65s, with or without a disability, is a huge factor when we look at the policy implications of Australia's future. So, the Treasury recently released its intergenerational report, and it's very clear we have an aging population. So the majority of Australians, when they age, would like to age actively at home. When we look at policy, we need to ensure that that is the crux of how we centre our aged care system and disability supports programs, ensuring that people are able to stay at home in whatever circumstances they face, whether they acquire a disability or not. When we look at the current aged care system, it is a little bit too all over the place. To explain it briefly, there are various levels of CAP supports that people can get. You can currently get entry level care and support via the Commonwealth Home Support Program. If you require higher support needs, you can get supports via a home care package through complex in home care and support. And then if you go to the highest level of supports, you will be entering residential aged care and receive 24-hour care and support. The aged care system also has other programs, such as the transitional care program, which assists people when they are discharged from hospital for a period of up to 12 weeks, potentially, with home supports to allow them to return home. But in those transitional care package, the services on offer do not extend to home modifications and the required needs that a lot of people have on returning home from hospital stays.
Social worker was good, and she was available, but it's, when you're not immersed in it, then it's a theoretical understanding rather than a in-depth understanding. But it was really lonely, and I hadn't really heard anybody kind of talk about that, and the kind of grief of just your life change is a process you have to go through, and was a process for Gary, of course. Then during the stay, we had to find out, how to manage when we got home, and COVID was a big sort of overlying influence in the end. But even his electric wheelchair, there was doubt about whether or not he'd get his electric wheelchair funded, and whether or not we'd have to get a second-hand one because we were on an aged care package and he wasn't as bad as, I don't know, somebody else. He had C4-5 fracture, so it was pretty bad, although it was incomplete. And when he was first injured, he couldn't move anything. But by the time he left hospital, he could actually stand up. So we did get a new wheelchair because the OT advocated for us, and we got one. But then when it came to doing our house renovations, we got a guy who you get 15,000 on the aged care package total. That's it for the renovations. He came, and we live in a unit. Luckily, the doors and everything are quite wide, but we were looking at what needed to be done, and we didn't know at that stage quite what he'd be able to do. So we were getting quotes for like getting down the stairs in the garden, getting a ramp and things at the front door. Well, the quote just for the ramp to get down into the garden was $15,000. The quote for the outside ramp was $150,000. And then we had to get the bathrooms redone, which the $15,000 was supposed to help cover as well. So in the end, we just didn't bother. I'm still waiting for the quote for the bathroom, but we paid $80,000 to get up. We got 2 bathrooms done, and we took money out of super, and we borrowed money from one of my sons to get it done. Because by the time it was time for Gary to come home, COVID was, hitting us, and there was a lot of pressure for immediate discharge. So it wasn't, we didn't have any kind of luxury. And then of course, we didn't get the front door or anything done. We've worked our way around that.
For those who acquire a disability are facing discharge from hospital, if they do not have accessible housing and they're facing tens of thousands of dollars in costs of home modifications, often there is very little choice if you don't have sufficient self-funding than to go into residential aged care, either temporarily or permanently. This is a really major concern, particularly for those with high disability support needs. So we often hear stories about people staying in a manual chair for 7, 8 hours straight because there isn't the staff to take them out. It really is an insufficient system when compared to the NDIS and other programs. And ultimately, it really just reflects the inherent discrimination against over 65-year-olds. So this is something we really need to re-examine and restructure. The amount of care that people receive shouldn't be based on a compromise system where people have to decide what they're going to do without simply because they can't self-fund the gaps.
Gary was self-catheterizing 4 or 5 times a day when we came home, and each catheter is $5 each. So what we got from Enable was 470 catheters. Well, that was like 12 weeks or less than 12 weeks. So we had to fund the rest. We had the choice of using the less good ones. These are, really good that people on NDIS are getting. And, the risk of urinary tract infection and the risk of illness and the risk, the risks of all those things. I don't know why everybody doesn't get them. There was a guy in hospital with Gary who was a pensioner he was isolated with COVID, and I didn't know till afterwards, he couldn't afford to hire the TV because he didn't have any money. And so anyway, so he wouldn't be able to afford it. So the risk for people that are, naive at catheterization, haven't got good hand function, and then they contaminate. So of course we got the top of the range ones for him. So there was that. Then the medications he was on were costing us $350 a month, and of course don't get a health card. So because when we could qualify, I was still working, and so our joint income was too much to do it. And by the time we needed it, it was too late.
Last year, our systemic advocacy team and our policy advocates, we really decided that we need to re-engage our cohort, the people we represent, people with spinal and neurological conditions, to really determine what are the top advocacy issues that they are facing in their lives. And I conducted a series of in-depth interviews during which I heard from Di and Susan. So it was great to hear their stories because they really illustrate a lot of the issues, the systemic issues that people are facing day to day. So from that engagement project, the top 3 issues that we identified as affecting people with spinal and neurological conditions across Australia are supports for over 65s with disability, universal access to assistive technology, particularly for those who are ineligible for the NDIS, and accessible housing, whether that's in the private or in the public market. So looking at those issues, supports for over 65s, this also coincided with the findings from the Royal Commission into Aged Care and Quality's findings coming out in March this year that really affirms that the aged care system needs to be restructured, because with an aging population, we need to consider how we support and how we respect and how we maintain the dignity of people as we age, whether it's our own generation, older generation. It affects all of us as carers, as older people, as people with disability. So we need to make sure that we have the right supports in place to ensure that all our human rights are respected. And I think in Di and Susan's situations, neither in the NDIS nor the aged care system are perfect, but we are seeing a major discriminatory gap. And the very fact that the NDIS, the age cutoff of 65, the NDIS Act is exempt from the Age Discrimination Act, seems to say it all for me.
Well, I feel blessed that I'm with the NDIS because I was in my 50s when I had the brain injury. So it was lucky, just timing was sort of lucky. People in the 60s often have a stroke, and they're like me. Then there's no help for them because they're too old to get into the NDIS.
I mean, I just feel that we're in a very fortunate position. So it's not so tough for me, but I know people, like if you're on an aged care pension, it would be impossible because you can't afford to, people can just manage on what they've got. And if you've got all these other extra expenses that are needed, it's appalling that has to happen. It was like the carers allowance. The carers allowance was $3,500 a year. And it sounds terrible, but I haven't got it because I don't want to get into the hands of Centrelink because of all the other stuff that's happened, but I just don't want to risk it. And we don't need it. But I mean, if you were on an aged care pension, you'd need it. And so there's a whole lot of bureaucratic impediments to you even maximising what is available, which I think are awful and ageist and, but reflective of the society we're in at the moment, I think.
Well, when I asked about it, they said, "Oh, you can have one or the other. You can't have both because that means you're double dipping." I only asked I asked about it after I came out of hospital, right? So I said, well, I'll stick with the NDIS because the other doesn't give me any therapy. You just have this sort of suspicious, if you apply for something else, they'll knock you off. So I was thinking, oh, I'll stay on the disability, so I won't worry about the travel allowance in case I get knocked off the NDIS. But then I found out that I wouldn't get knocked off.
So, Megan, a lot of people might be confused and they might think that you need to have either one or the other. That's simply not the case, right?
So I think it's an interesting one. I think it's such a mammoth system, and there are so many different programs, and it's just so overwhelming. And I mean, I work in this space, but it's very, very difficult to understand all the streams and what people are eligible for, and if I receive those supports, am I disqualified from that, and this kind of thing. So it's a really, really confusing system. And so for a lot of people, trying to navigate this is huge. I've heard stories of people not even being aware that they're eligible for the carers allowance. And so without that income stream, again, their force or their self-funding is increased. But in some, so there's just this massive information gap and misinformation that goes on as well. So as Susan was explaining, there was a lot of confusion between if I have an NDIS plan, am I eligible still for the age pension, and can I still get supports through the aged care system? So it's a really, really confusing system. But in terms of the age pension, I think it's an interesting one because if you look at rental affordability as well, already for accessible housing, the number of properties listed are severely decreased. Um, and then when you look for an accessible property, if you're on the age pension, it is often impossible if you look at Sydney and the Greater Illawarra region. I think it's something like less than 1% of properties are actually affordable for people on the age pension. And then you sort of bring into it your eligibility for a home care package. That's sort of rendered irrelevant if you can't afford a property to stay in. The other aspect as well is if you're receiving the age pension, then maybe your supports via the Commonwealth Support at Home program or the home care package may be influenced because you are receiving an income. So it's all very, very confusing. And it's almost like you want to present the worst case scenario just to receive the highest cap in funding. But it is overwhelming, the information gap and misinformation going around. So I think it's a really important one. And the other element to remember is for a lot of older people who may not be computer literate, who may not have smartphones, who may not have access to the internet, or may not have support people around them to assist them in finding these services, there's just a massive information gap, and they may not realize what they're eligible for and be left without supports for extended periods of time. So that was another element I didn't even mention, that even if you get approved for a home care package, it's still going to be 15 to 18 months before you actually receive supports, which is woefully inadequate to people's needs. It's absolutely atrocious.
So the aged care package lasted for 3 months, and they handed over to Spinal Outreach. When the transition time was coming, Spinal Outreach said, we need to decide, do we want to go on an aged care package, which would take 15 or 18 months to get, or what do we want to do? The physio from Spinal Outreach came as we were doing it, and he said he rang the local hospital who does rehab, and he said the physio there was very nice, and he said, oh yeah, he'd take Gary on, but he doesn't know anything about spinal injury. So if we had no money, that was where Gary would go, to a place that doesn't know anything about spinal injury, and probably only for a limited time. It's irritating because I rang up in Able, New South Wales, and I rang up because one of the things that Gary was prescribed was pull-up pants, like those incontinence pants. And I rang up and I said, look, he doesn't need those, so can we move that funding to pay for catheters? Oh, no, you can't do that. No, not allowed to do that. So then one day I got annoyed with the guy and I said, if I was on the NDIS, we'd get what we want. Well, he went for me. He said, my relative's on NDIS and he's not getting it, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, oh, anyway. So that's all we got, the 400 and something. Luckily for us, one of our friend's daughters works at Neuromoves, which is, the specialty spinal rehab. So we knew about Neuromoves, but we had never heard about Neuromoves when we were in the hospital. And that annoyed me because I think we should get options Whether they like it or not, you need to be given the range of options, and it's up to you what you choose.
When Di and Gary decided to trial the exercise programs at Neuromoves, they took money from their superannuation to help finance it. And then Di returned to work in her 70s as a lecturer. Exercise physiology and physiotherapy services such as these are funded through the NDIS. These services can become costly and, although the benefits are obvious, can be unattainable for somebody over 65 who relies on government support such as the pension.
But the change, it's just amazingly fantastic. Because people say things like, oh, 2 years after your injury, nothing improves. And whereas they're much more goal focused and much more, what do you want to achieve? So I reckon that's about $30,000 a year. So I'm really fortunate because I was still registered. So I've gone back to work. I'm actually working 4 days a week now. So we feel like we've got a future together. Like Gary's got a future, because it was interesting what Susan said about being deconditioned, because he was part of a research project looking at hand function and robotics. But he dropped back to two days a week for 1 hour, and he deconditioned in that month. Whereas now he has 3 sessions a week, 2 of 1.5 and 1 hour. It's just because financially that's all we can afford. He's got his reconditioned again and improving. So it's so worth it.
The support needs, particularly for personal daily care, increase over time, and this is why particularly the burden on carers, the partners of people with those high support needs, increase over time, and why it's quite a demanding ask for them. Through the aged care system, the Commonwealth Home Support Program, the 5 most common service types are domestic assistance, allied health, transport, home maintenance, and nursing. I think what's interesting there is when you look at those, they're all mainly service based. I think there's not enough focus in the aged care system on how assistive technology or low cost assistive technology could assist older Australians in their daily support needs and improving their independence in living at home. There have been studies from last year on how increased investment in assistive technology through the CHSP program could radically improve the outcomes for people living at home, both in terms of decreasing the risk of burden on the healthcare system if they do push themselves to reach that higher shelf in the kitchen and then subsequently fall down. Those kind of I'm not a big fan on the focus on economic analyses, but I think it is important to look at alternative ways in redefunding these funding systems and also focusing on the role of assistive tech and home modifications for people with lower support needs, not just focusing on high cost assistive tech for people with higher support costs. The home care package program, again, the most prominent support services through HCPs between 2018 and 2019 were personal care, cleaning, and household tasks, social support, shopping services, community access services. So those supports are relatively similar to the supports that you could get through the NDIS. However, I think it's important to note that the NDIS has changed the shape of disability services and the marketplace throughout Australia. The National Disability Strategy is being redrafted for the next 10 years this year, and in preparing research and reviews of that strategy, numerous comments have come out that have really reflected how, as one person said, the NDIS has sucked the air out of the room. The carer pool for people who are not on the NDIS, those who are receiving care via the aged care system, is a lot smaller.
Yeah, I think it's just a reflection of ageism in society, isn't it? That, when you're 65, you're wiped off, and in the old days, people used to die. Whereas now, really people are active and doing all sorts of things. So I'm a real fan of the NDIS, and I think it's a shame that it doesn't cover aged care.
I wrote Linda Reynolds, because there was hearing all the time, oh, NDIS is not sustainable. I said, what about all the jobs we provide? Like, I'm a job generator. I must have given, with my needs, I must have employed at least 100 people a year. So we're a broad-based job generation. Add to that all the bloody old age pensioners. We keep Australia moving, basically, in jobs. Like all these people that go to uni. learn to be a physio. Who employs them? We do.
Yeah, I don't think they care, to be honest. I think all they care about is keeping people quiet. I'd like to see the NDIS embedded, and I mean, it's not blowing out. If you look at what they said the budget was going to be for the NDIS, it's actually getting towards what they anticipated it would be. But it's all this rhetoric about how it's blowing out. And I think we've got a moral and ethical responsibility to maximise the function of all our citizens. I think that one of the things I noticed in the UK, which we're not good at here, is that the presence of people with disability on TV, that it normalizes the presence of disability. Like, people live good lives. Just because they're in a wheelchair doesn't mean that they're half-witted. It's kind of like, allow people to function to the best of their ability. And I think that, I mean, I won't get going on the government because we could run out of time, but I think that if we if we could embed NDIS in the same way as Medicare's embedded, properly funded, then we've got a good future.
I want to kind of speak about why younger people should care about this as an issue. Why should they care about it at all?
I mean, I didn't think I was going to ever really have a brain injury. And Di's husband wouldn't have thought he was going to have a spinal cord. You just don't, that's not in your thing to think about for the future. So they should put some scenarios out there that you can think, oh, wow, that might, I would never have thought that might happen to me.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because there's a big resentment against baby boomers because we're seen to be, well, we're the lucky generation. We've been through a lot of, a good life. So it is hard when people are struggling to pay rent and to save for houses and all that sort of stuff. Why should they care? So I think it's more about equity than framing it for old people, because I think people are over old people generally in society. So I think if it's more about that than, yeah, because otherwise they just think, oh God, give me a break, whinging old people.
Yeah, I definitely have many thoughts on this. And to go back to that question of what can the government do, I think it really goes back to that question of equity. Like, we need to think about this in a long-term way. And the NDIS is not a perfect system, and there are lots of improvements to be made, but the underlying philosophy should be integrated across the board in all our social service programs, that it's about empowering people to live dignified, normal lives where they don't face barriers. I think as a young person, it's interesting because I've been thinking about it more and more. As for my parents, at least, one of my parents has a chronic health condition, and while their functioning currently is okay, they don't require supports. They're approaching 65, and in my mind, I think, gosh, wow, like if their functioning does decrease, which is probably likely in the next 5 years, they're going to be in the aged care system, and that equity is just going to be lost. There is no opportunity potentially, and that paradigm shift needs to happen, that my parent is still a person with goals and aspirations, and just because they've turned 65 does not make a difference in what they can achieve in their life. As a young person as well, Australia has an aging population. We need to recognize that um, we're all going to be part of this. We need to think about our sustainable futures and think about not only our parents' futures, but our futures as well, because disability will affect all of us in one way or another, whether we acquire a disability, whether we have a congenital disability, whether we know someone with disability. I think, as everyone has said, we need to normalize disability and normalize this understanding that everyone is entitled to a dignified life, and everyone should be supported and fulfilled to live those kind of lives. So it's all part and parcel. And then also, if you take it through just a financial lens, which the government quite often likes to do in cost cutting and financial sustainability and these headlines, the aged care sector and support services, these sectors are huge, and they provide massive employment opportunities for young people, as Susan mentioned earlier. So from all perspectives, I think it's not just about investing in older people or younger people, it's investing in our equitable, sustainable futures and investing in a society in which we all can have the opportunity to live dignified lives.
With that in mind, what can you do to try and make some change, Megan?
So there are lots of opportunities, and our team is definitely exploring more avenues to how we hold government accountable. But at this stage, one of the most exciting developments at the moment is SCIA is part of the Assistive Technology for All campaign, which is a coalition of organisations throughout Australia that are essentially advocating for the establishment of a national assistive technology program. So for all people, whether they're eligible for the NDIS or not, for all those cohorts that aren't eligible, which substantially affects people aged over 65, they would be able to access and fund without sort of making compromises in other aspects of their life assistive technology, home modifications, live assistive technology like assistant animals that will fundamentally improve their independence and ability to achieve their life goals. So it's the Assistive Technology for All Alliance, they've launched their major campaign, and currently we're asking Senator Anne Ruston to include a national assistive technology program in the new national disability strategy, which is currently being drafted and which will cover 2020 to 2030. So what we would love is for all people, young, old, middle-aged, whatever you are, to potentially contact your local federal MP, hustle the Senator Ruston, to really include a national equipment scheme or national assistive tech scheme. So hop on the Assistive Tech for All .org.au website and you can find details about how to lobby your local MPs and the actions that you can take, sharing the petition to really get the word around about the significance of establishing a national scheme. But yeah, there is lots of exciting opportunities. We need to improve and ensure that there is a paradigm shift, that we need to ensure that everyone has the supports that they need, holistic supports, that no one is going out, no one is making compromises.
You've been listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. We have so much information we want to share with you. If you'd like to know more about anything we've spoken about, please check the show notes at the bottom of this episode. We also want to hear your stories. If you'd like to share your experiences, head over to our online forum at scia.org.au/forum. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please consider giving us a 5-star review. Your review will help us get more people to listen to the show. And finally, if you're on social media, why not send us over some love? We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you for listening.